How's it going, everyone? I'm Evan.
I'm Bashkim.
And we're the MTG guys, here to talk to you about commons from standard sets of the last 2 years.
So these cards are going to be heaters in Commander. You can find them in your bulk collection if you really look, or you can just pick them up for a couple cents a piece. We're going to be starting off with Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths from about 2 years ago.
Ikoria came out in April of 2020, roughly 2 years ago, so this is going to be our first set we talk about. I want to start off with the card Wilt. This is just naturalized that has cycling for 2, so it gives you more than just the option of destroying an artifact or enchantment. Cathartic Reunion was reprinted in this set. It is helpful in most red decks. At the minimum, it filters your hand. If you can manage to copy the spell, it becomes a wicked draw spell. It also lets you select what cards from your hand go into the graveyard, so if you have any reanimation, you can pitch your best targets. Of One Mind is a great spell if your commander is a human, because most of the time you're going to have a non-human card in your deck or on the battlefield, so this will just read 1 blue, draw 2 cards. Gust of Wind is a perfectly playable card if your commander has flying, because it's for 2 mana, you're going to get to bounce a non-land permanent you don't control and draw a card. We want to make sure our commander has flying so that we can cast this for 2 mana the majority of the time. For 4 mana, it's a little bit inefficient, and I would say not playable. Fertilid is one of those cards that is always getting reprinted. It's a bit inefficient, but you can use it multiple times to ramp. Also, if you have ways to put more counters on it, you can end up with a ton of land. Ram Through can be a great spell if your deck revolves around making some massive creatures. It can be a removal spell, and essentially a fling at the same time without even sacrificing your creature.
We're going to be taking these sets in chronological order, so next up is Zendikar Rising. It has some heater commons that you definitely have sitting in your bulk right now. I have been burned by the fact that this card is a sorcery before. However, Feed the Swarm in Mono Black or even Dimir list is one of the only ways you can actually answer enchantments. The life lost might hurt, but not being able to answer that Rest in Peace hurts even more. We need to be playing answers for the amount of completely busted lands in Commander. We can look at cards like Gaia's Cradle, Cabal Coffers, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, and Glacial Chasm, and see that if we leave these cards in play, our opponents are simply going to win. This also has the incredible upside of being a rampant growth that draws a card in mono red if you just have a Darksteel Citadel in play. I think if you care about at least 3 of the 4 modes on this card, it's playable. It's generally worse than Growth Spile, but if you really want counters on your creatures, or if you care about the life total, or if you're just playing on a budget, all of the text on the card is just good. I think Haste as a keyword is kind of underrated in Commander. Tuk Tuk Rubblefort is a 3-drop common that allows all of your other big beaters to swing right away and not give your opponents time to untap and deal with them. Into the Royal actually saw some CEDH play when it was first printed. Yes, bouncing something isn't as good as simply killing it, but the card offers incredible flexibility in other ways. You're able to bounce your own permanents and able to abuse their ETBs again, or you can bounce any problematic permanent to save you from a spicy situation. If you're short on cards, you can even just use this to cantrip through your library. Next up is the Nordic set of Kaldheim. The first card we're going to talk about is Mass Vandal. This card is incredibly underplayed, and it costs 1 less mana than Reclamation Sage. It also has a changeling creature type, so it works with every single tribal synergy. Yes, there is a cost of exiling a card in your graveyard, but if you're playing a creature deck, chances are you're going to have a creature in your graveyard you don't mind exiling. Cost reducers are just incredibly good in EDH, and Starnheim Courser does this, but for 2 different permanent types. If you're in white and playing either enchantments or artifacts as a theme, having this as a source of ramp instead of another 3-mana rock has a potential to ramp you 2 to 3 mana in a turn instead of just 1. These cards really go crazy when you start to have multiple of these effects in play, and you can start ripping artifacts or enchantment for close to free. Snakeskin Veil allows us to protect our most important creature at instant speed. I do think you need to care about the 1/1 counter that the card gives in order to really take advantage of it, because there are so many effects at the same mana cost. Village Rites is a 1 mana draw to at instant speed. Just make sure you have enough creature fodder to toss to this spell. We can look at cards like Dockside Extortionist and Smothering Tithe just to see how busted treasures can be. I'm not saying Goldvein Pick is anywhere near the level as these cards, but it can be a really neat piece of ramp in decks that care about equipping and attacking. Raise the Draugr is one way to recur creatures from your graveyard at instant speed. I think the card is really good in tribal decks that like playing with their graveyard, but it can also be used to get back key pieces after a board wipe. It being an instant also allows you to deny someone from exiling or reanimating key pieces from your graveyard.
Strixhaven is one of the coolest sets to come out in the past 2 years. It also brings my favorite common in this list, but it also had some commons that were printed into Mystical Archive, but we won't be talking about those because they didn't take up a common slot. The first card I want to get into is Thrilling Discovery. It's the same thing as Cathartic Reunion, but in Boros and gets you a little bit of life. Card filter is super important, especially in these colors that lack major card advantage. And you also don't have to discard until resolution, so if an opponent counters it, you still get to keep your cards. We've been consistently talking about this card for a while. It is my favorite card on the list, and it is an incredible removal spell. It exiles either an artifact or a creature, and a 4/4 is not even that bad to deal with. And in some very niche situations, exiling your mana rock and an opponent's end step for an extra 4/4 can just help you get there. Curate essentially reads, Surveil 2, draw a card. I normally wouldn't play a card like this, but if you are a graveyard deck and need some ways to filter your cards into the graveyard, this may not be a bad option. Especially because you get to choose what cards go in the graveyard rather than mill, you don't have to give away an important piece. Biblioplex Assistant is mainly specific to black decks or for redundancy in other colors. Black has a tough time returning non-creature cards from the graveyard, and this is a potentially viable option to bring back some important pieces when you accidentally mill them, especially in some graveyard strategies that maybe you're in reanimation and you're trying to mill a bunch of creatures and you hit a reanimation spell. Biblioplex Assistant will put that spell back on top of your deck. Charge Through is a trample-giving cantrip in green. For 1 mana, it replaces itself and gives a big creature some massive hooves until the end of turn, helping you dig deep and get some damage in. Moving on to Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. This was kind of a dud of a set, but it came out with some pretty good commons. Deadly Dispute is a ridiculous card at common, sacrificing an artifact or creature to draw 2 and make a treasure token at instant speed on 2 mana. It can be used to chump block a big creature and sacrifice your creature in response. It gives card advantage. The treasure can be used to put you a mana up on a next turn. Overall, this card is fantastic and gives us so many different options. Unexpected Windfall is card filter at instant speed that's going to refund 2 of your mana that you can use on a later turn. It's a decent card. Card filter is needed in red. It's not bad. Feign Death is a cool way at instant speed to protect your commander or to protect any other big creature or even stuff with ETB effects. You can even sacrifice an ETB creature when you use Feign Death on it to bring it back to the battlefield and get its effect again. And now we have Dawnbringer Cleric. This is a 3-mode ETB white creature, which is just a recipe for versatility. It can hit an enchantment or hate out an important graveyard piece. Also, you can gain a bit of life in a tight situation. It does a lot of different things. You can abuse it with flickers. It's good on its own. It's just going to always be useful.
Next is the first of the 2 Innistrad sets, Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Consider has to be one of the best cantrips in the format right now. The card is a strict upgrade to Opt, a card that was seeing a ton of play. If you have any graveyard synergies and you want to be digging into your deck, you should consider this card. Cathar Commando could just be better than Caustic Caterpillar and Kazali Pride Mage. It having Flash allows you to hold up mana and catch people off guard. I love playing this in my mono white equipment deck because it's either a valuable piece of removal or a 3/1 body that I can suit up and beat face with. Otherworldly Gaze is admittedly a niche card, but it's really good in graveyard strategies or in decks that really care about the tops of their library. You can cast it for 1, do the thing, and then flash it back whenever you want and do it again. This one card allows you to dig 6 cards deep when you really need an answer, and you can even just use it to smooth out your draws if you're looking for lands. Ardent Elementalist works really well in a mono red or an Izzet Spellslinger deck that wants to be recurring its instants and sorceries. The card is 4 mana, which is pretty on rate for the effect it offers. Geistwave is another card that's in the same vein as Into the Royal. Bouncing a permanent for 2 mana instant speed is on rate, and it allows you to deal with types you might not be able to otherwise. There's also the upside of when you bounce a permanent you control to prevent it from being removed, or if it has an ETB that you want to repeat, you get to also draw an extra card. Novice Occultist is tier 1 sack fodder. It really wants to die, and Aristocrats decks love cards like these because they replace themselves when they die. It also gets really good when you have other sacrifice energy pieces on board. Return to Nature is a removal spell we went over in our guide to removal in EDH. Yes, it's not as good as Nature's Claim, but exiling a card from a graveyard is a surprisingly useful mode on this card. There aren't too many graveyard interaction pieces at instant speed, and this is one of the better ones. Blade Band can be a 2-mana removal spell that cantrips in an attacking meta. There is a pretty big downside of not being able to remove a creature that you really need to that's not attacking you, but the card is almost always going to be a 2-for-1 because it replaces itself.
If I learned anything in life, when werewolves show up, so do vampires. That's why we're moving on to Innistrad Crimson Vow. Reckless Impulse is the card advantage we needed in red. It's essentially 2 mana, draw 2 cards. This slots into every Gruul, every Boros deck, and perfectly in Prosper. Abrade is a great card. We've said it before, I'll say it now. 2 mana, instant speed, hits creatures, hits artifacts. It's just going to be useful. It's great in red, great common. Mulch has the ability to bring some serious card advantage into green. 1, it fills your graveyard with non-land cards. 2, it can grab up to 4 lands from the top of your deck and put them in your hand. So it can be 2 mana up to draw 4, or fill your graveyard with useful things. It's overall a pretty valuable card, and I would say we can slot it into a lot of decks. Kessig Flamebreather can deal some consistent damage in your Spellslinger decks. It also works really well in artifact decks or enchantment decks because it is a non-creature spell, not just instant or sorcery. And for a 1/3 on 2, it isn't bad as an early game blocker, but it can really push maybe 8 or 9 damage if it survives for a long time. Undying Malice is just like Feign Death. It can protect our creatures, it can protect our commander, it synergizes well with ETB and death triggers. It overall can just be really useful if you're playing on a budget. Ending with the most recent set, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. I am a big artifact player, and this brought a lot of support for artifacts, enchantments, and kind of everything you wanted to do, so let's get into it. Starting off with Experimental Synthesizer. It's going to give you a card every time it enters and leaves, not when it's destroyed or hits the graveyard. So every time you flicker it, you're going to get more and more cards. You can really abuse it, and you can sacrifice it, get a token, recur it with some kind of effect. It's just going to give you great value for just a common. Spirited Companion is another one of your 2 mana creature cantrips. It can hold equipment, it's a great flicker target, but this one is an enchantment. So for all of your Enchantress effects, you're going to get to draw a card. For all of your Constellation triggers, you're going to get whatever those are. It has more and more value just because it's an enchantment. Now we've got Tamiyo's Safekeeping. This is a 1 mana instant speed protection spell. It's going to give hexproof and indestructible to any permanent for just 1 mana. And it's going to give you 2 life, which is just a little bit of icing on the cake. But it can save any of your artifacts, any of your creatures, any of your enchantments. For just 1 mana and instant speed, it can really blow out your opponent. Moonsnare Prototype is probably one of my favorite cards that they printed in this set. In the early game, it acts like Springleaf Drum. It's ramp, it's going to help us accelerate our game plan, but if we draw it late, we can either put a card that our opponent controls on the top or bottom of their library, or if we have a card, maybe we need to protect it and we want to cast it again, we can even put our own permanent on top of our deck. Disruption Protocol is a budget option for counterspells in artifact-based decks. If you're looking for a counterspell that is absolutely dirt cheap and you probably already have, this is definitely playable as long as you have artifacts that you're not tapping every turn. Mnemonic Sphere is very specific to the deck. It fits well with graveyard strategies because you can cycle it in the early game and abuse it in the late game. It is just versatile enough to be playable. This next card is for all you mono black players looking to get rid of maybe a pesky enchantment. For 2 and a black, you can either pick a creature or an enchantment and that player is going to exile one of their choice. Now, this is just an option. It is a little bit overcosted, but again, we're pretty limited on enchantment removal in mono black. Planner Incision is one of the better flicker spells in my opinion. It hits both artifacts and creatures. It can target your opponent's permanent, which lets you put any artifact or creature they may have taken from you back on the battlefield under your control. It nets mana with Gilded Lotus, and it is now one of 3 flicker spells in blue that cost 2 or less.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Make sure to let us know what commons that you'd like to play in your commander deck.
Don't forget to leave us a like and a subscribe, and check out our other videos. Thanks again.